to come up and to address this topic. Actually, Mike is going to be doing it from his location here. Professor Michael Wallace is a professor emeritus from the University of British Columbia, and he's had previous visiting professorships at the University of Michigan and l'École des Hautes Études Internationales. He's currently the coordinator of the Canadian Pugwash Group's Arctic Security Working Group, and he's the author of many publications on nuclear weapons and accidental nuclear war, the nuclear fuel cycle, ballistic missiles defenses, and other weapon systems, including nuclear weapons-free zones. Please join me in welcoming Michael Wallace.
Thank you. I'm just checking to see if everyone can hear me all right? Good. Okay. My presentation this afternoon is based on a much longer paper that Steve and I collaborated in writing, and it's just basically we're calling it remarks because it's not organized enough really to be a full paper yet. It's on the website for this conference, zeronuclearweapons.com, and I invite you to take a look at the whole thing because of necessity, since I've got 10 minutes, I've got to cut down an awful lot out. My starting point is going to be is simply that there is an increasing amount of military buildup in the Arctic littoral and, of course, under the ocean. The melting ice offers access to trade routes and, of course, even more important, ultimately, to the undersea resources, oil and various minerals. Now, the nations are very busy staking claims. We've all seen articles about Russia's rather dramatic gestures of flag planting and so on. The little tiff between Canada and Denmark about Hans Island, the Northwest Passage, which I'm going to leave to my much more learned colleague in national law over here, Michael Byers. But the point is the military competition in the Arctic littoral is increasing. There's no question about that. Now, what we want to do, it's not so much that the immediate competition is right now staring us in the face of possibly creating a war, but there is a danger once you start a military buildup, that a military buildup will get a classic arms tension spiral going. And that's always a risk, and therefore you want to nip it in the bud. You don't want to let it get to the point where you've got to undo a whole bunch of stuff. It's much better if you get to it right away. And the idea of an Arctic nuclear weapons-free zone is part of that, as I'll show. As a matter of fact, that's why in 2007, the Canadian Pugwash Group called for an Arctic nuclear weapons-free zone, and quite a number of other organizations, especially in the Nordic countries, have been very supportive of this. Not so much, obviously, in the two major nuclear weapon states, which unfortunately represent between them the largest barriers to having an Arctic nuclear weapons-free zone. Obviously, the Russian Federation deploys a very large number of ballistic missile submarines in the Arctic. It's the place where its patrol boxes, as they call them, are for the most part. About 2/3 of their fleet is in the Northern Fleet in the Arctic, the other third in the Pacific, and certainly all of their newest submarines are in the Northern Fleet. The Northern Fleet is based inside the Arctic Circle and comprises a ring of institutions near and around the Kola Peninsula, bases and so on. I don't have a good map of it, but looking at this here, you can see the Kola Peninsula near around Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, the two major populated areas, and there are an awful lot of nuclear installations of various types, nuclear weapons storage areas, and so on. But it's not only the Russian Federation that's an obstacle here. The United States is also an obstacle, in the sense that although it is also an Arctic state by virtue, as you can see, of Alaska, it is very unlikely to want to participate, at least at this point, in a nuclear weapons-free zone. That's never been part of its way of looking at nuclear weapons and its position in the world. Not only is it unlikely to participate, it's also likely in some ways, as at least in the past it has been, to hinder the participation of others in a nuclear weapons-free zone. Because most of the other Arctic states, besides the two nuclear weapons states, are members of NATO, and as members of NATO, you can turn that back. I think I don't need it. As members of NATO, they of course are bound by the NATO strategic concept, and the NATO strategic concept has nuclear weapons as a front and center, as a crucial part of the NATO treaty, and the guarantee under Article 5 being ultimately, if necessary, backed up by the use of nuclear weapons. Consequently, the United States has a very, very dim view of member nations of NATO participating in non-nuclear things, zones and so on. Still maintains rather ludicrously a number of tactical nuclear weapons in Europe, the purpose of which completely escapes me, but nevertheless, they're there. And since they're there, the United States doesn't like changing them, or at least hasn't until now. And in much the same way, the United States is likely to resist, at least at the moment, is likely to resist a denuclearization treaty that comprises the entire polar area and whose members are almost entirely members of NATO. That's not likely to be something we'll be happy about. Then also, of course, there's the dispute between Canada and the United States over the Northwest Passage, and I will simply defer to Michael Byers over that, because he just finished writing a book about it. He knows a heck of a lot more than I do, so I'll just let that go. The question then becomes, if you want to have an Arctic nuclear weapons-free zone, how to do it. And I think the first answer would have to be as part of a general arms control agreement between the Russian Federation and the United States. In other words, the only way to get nukes out of the Arctic will be to have fewer nukes. The only way that the Russians would even remotely be tempted or might possibly accept notion of denuclearizing its Arctic would be if the number of nuclear weapons on both sides were drawn down to a very considerably lower fraction of what they are now. I've got some numbers and stuff in here, and of course you're all familiar with those numbers, so I won't go ahead with it. So obviously a lower overall number of nuclear weapons would make everything easier, but there's a huge number of unknowns here, because we don't know at the moment exactly. We've got some educated guesses, and we've got some inside rumors about how the negotiations between the Russian Federation and the United States are going. We don't know exactly, although we've got some rumors about what the Pentagon's going to come up with their nuclear posture review. What we do know, however, and what is very encouraging, we do know that President Obama is personally and deeply committed to large-scale denuclearization of not only with regard to the United States and the Russian Federation, but also the globe in general, and the notion of he takes Article 6 very, very seriously, and that he must go ahead with it. But of course, in the United States, the president cannot act alone in these matters. There's a lot of other players from the Pentagon to Congress and so on. However, if Obama prevails and if the total number of warheads and launchers is reduced substantially, then the incentive for the Russian Federation to maintain large numbers of nuclear weapons in its own Arctic littoral will be reduced considerably. So that's one way we can approach it. One way it could be approached as part of and as an integral part of a general movement towards whole-scale nuclear disarmament, especially between the two largest nuclear powers. Okay, well, if we can't get that immediately, and we don't know what the probabilities are yet, we will probably within a few months, or certainly 6 months or so, I imagine. But if we, regardless of that, we can still go ahead and take some baby steps, if you will, to move slowly and gradually towards an Arctic nuclear weapons-free zone. One thing we could do would be to have agreements to keep ports nuclear-free. That can be done unilaterally by states. They can say we do not want any nuclear cargoes in our ports. A number of states have already done that in different contexts. We can also start, of course, with the smaller and medium states and gradually add more. There's no reason why everybody has to all join at once. And we can probably get started with some combination of Denmark and Canada and Iceland, Norway and Sweden. Perhaps not Canada under the current government, but under perhaps a little more flexible and less totally pro-American government than we have now. And also the parliamentarians for nuclear disarmament have suggested that everyone put pressure on the two Arctic nuclear weapons states. If they're not prepared to agree to a nuclear weapons-free zone, at least agree to provide negative security guarantees for the Arctic region. That is, they would agree not to attack a non-nuclear weapons state in the Arctic region, even if they're not prepared to participate fully. That would be a big step forward all by itself. It would reduce the incentive to militarize by a considerable amount. Steve, how am I doing for time? Okay, quickly then. All right, the notion has been up until now then that small and medium states have to kowtow to the major nuclear weapon states in these kinds of matters. And I think, to quote Bob Dylan, early Bob Dylan from my youth, the times they are a-changin'. The willingness of small states to go along with the Cold War detritus and idiocies of the major states is rapidly diminishing. We see this, of course, more in Europe than we do in Canada, but it's certainly happening. And a greater willingness then to challenge the rickety old structure of the Cold War. Even more fundamentally, and I think this is where we've got to get to ultimately, is a challenge to the entire Westphalian paradigm as a way to operate and grow in the Arctic. The notion of states competing militarily and the war of all against all, which the Westphalian paradigm implies. We've got to move away from that, and I think most people who are serious about the Arctic and things around the Arctic do believe that that's the way we have to operate and grow, is to ditch the old state versus state model of interaction towards a more cooperative, multinational, well, more generally cooperative model. Sorry, I didn't end very well there, but my time's up, so I'll stop. You can ask questions, and the paper, as I said, is on the website. So